Welcome, everybody. Welcome to RAPES, Refugee and Immigrant Volunteer Summit 2024. My name is Thin. I'm the coordinator for volunteer engagement and outreach at the Reestablished Richmond. Before I move on to introducing our presenter, just a few virtual housekeeping. I would like to request everybody to keep your microphone mute if you're not asking questions. And also, if you have questions, it would be great if you can put them in the chat so that we know there'll be a lot of questions, and so that if we don't have enough time, we can take those questions and send you the answer afterwards. And this session will take, it's scheduled for an hour, but we're gonna try to wrap up around 5 or 10 minutes early because we do wanna give our audience a chance to ask 1 or 2 questions. So of course we are here for trauma-informed strategies session by our presenter, Mr. Joseph Feldman. I would like to introduce a little bit about him. So Mr. Joseph Feldman is currently the Prevention Training Coordinator at Greater Richmond SCAN. He has a Master of Science in Social Work and also Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. He's also licensed clinical social worker. He's also a doctoral candidate in urban education studies. His research focuses on the ways that educators conceptualize trauma and the impact that has on their practice. He has presented to local and national audiences about this topic of trauma, which he became interested in due to his experience as a foster and adopted parent. He have worked in social services field for over a decade in areas such as residential treatment, service coordination, LGBTQ services, school-based therapy, and trauma-informed education. We're really excited to have Joseph today, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot from him. So with that all, Joseph, let me hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Then. Good afternoon, everyone. As Then mentioned, my name is Joey Feldman, and I am the Prevention Training Coordinator with Greater Richmond SCAN. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today for our session on trauma-informed strategies. As a heads up, this is typically a 2-hour training that we give, so I've tried to cut as much out as I could just to give some overviews for you all. So I may be rushing through a little bit at times just to get through the info, but I do want to make sure that we kind of get through everything here. So before we start, we always like to take a moment just to ensure that we are in a space to engage in learning. So if you don't mind, to try to minimize any distractions, grab anything you may need, and really try to ensure your comfort. The image you see on the left side of the screen here is something a special education teacher I worked with here in a local school district would use with her students every morning to try to kind of do the same thing, right? To see what it was that they needed in that moment to engage in a place of learning. Just as a heads up, you will be getting a PDF copy of the slides today that will be included in kind of the follow-up from the conference. So don't feel like you need to write everything down. You will have access to this information afterward, but feel free to take notes as we go along. The last thing we always like to caution is that we know that talking about trauma can be triggering. So if at any point during our conversation today, things start to feel a bit heavy for you, feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. All right, so our goal is to hopefully either provide some new information or deepen your current understanding of trauma-informed strategies. And part of that is we want to also have some tools that we can provide for you all to walk away with and be able to use in the future. One of those is something we call Take 5 breathing. So one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later as we are talking about trauma and stress is that we know that when these stressful or traumatic situations are happening, there are lots of changes in our body, right? So our body is really preparing us to fight, to run, right? To overpower a predator, right? So as we have these stress hormones pumping through our bodies, that causes our heartbeat to increase, our breathing to become more shallow. So one of the things that we know is that deep breathing techniques can be super helpful. This is one that I really like because you don't need any special tools for it. So with this Take 5 breathing, what you are doing is either you or someone you're working with, you would just kind of put your hand up and you're taking a finger on your other hand and tracing around. So as I'm tracing up each finger, I would be taking a deep breath in through my nose. Going to hold for just a second at the top. And as I'm tracing down each finger, I'm taking a deep breath out through my mouth. Right, so we're going to be talking about some different types of regulation, regulation strategies as we go through here. So this is one that we wanted to just kind of start with to go ahead and throw one out there for your toolbox. All right, so our agenda for today, we are going to be starting here with kind of a very brief overview of trauma and some of the impacts of trauma on our developing brains and bodies. The bulk of our presentation today will focus on the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which you may have heard referred to as SAMHSA. There are 6 principles of trauma-informed care. So we'll go over what each of those are and some different strategies for each. So those 6 principles will focus on our safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. And as Thin mentioned, if you do have questions as we're going through, feel free to drop those in the chat. All right, so starting out, just thinking about what is trauma. So this word can be used in different contexts. If you are someone who likes to watch a lot of the medical shows on TV or some of the crime-solving shows, you may have heard, the term blunt force trauma, right? Or maybe some other type of medical trauma. The type of trauma we're going to be talking about today is what we would call psychological or emotional trauma. And again, we use the SAMHSA definition here of trauma, which is what they call their 3 E's. So it results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And then it also has some type of lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, right? And that could be physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual, right? So sometimes I think as we are, kind of thinking about these types of emotional trauma, we think about an event itself. But it's important to keep in mind that it's not the event itself, but the way the individual experiences that event and the effects it has on their functioning. Right? So 2 people can experience the very same event, and for one, that may be experienced as traumatic, and for another, it may not. Another thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about traumas is that they often result in feelings of helplessness or powerlessness, right? So as we are thinking back to some of the interventions that we'll get to in a bit here, it'll be important to remember this. Because anything we can do that's going to increase that sense of control that individual has is going to be super helpful. So there are many, many, many different types of trauma. Some of the most common types of trauma that you will read about in the trauma literature are these 4 that we have listed here on the screen. So those are acute, chronic, complex, and historical. So acute traumas are things that may be short-lived or only happen one time, right? So you may think of some type of natural disaster, right? A tornado or a hurricane. You may think of a car accident. You may think of maybe some type of isolated violent crime that someone is involved in, right? So those acute traumas are those things that are either short-lived or only happening one time. Chronic traumas are things that are more ongoing or maybe happening repeatedly over time. So when I think about chronic traumas, right, this may include things like abuse or neglect, right? Things that are happening repeatedly, domestic violence, maybe a parent or caregiver with substance use issues, right? This could look like ongoing racism or oppression, right? So those things that are happening repeatedly over time. Now we move into our next category here, which is complex trauma. And these are actually a type of chronic trauma, right? So they're things that are happening repeatedly over time. But what sets them apart is that they often begin very early in an individual's life and involve someone in a caretaking role, right? So these complex traumas are typically related to things like abuse or neglect that we mentioned in the chronic category, right? Especially when those are happening very early in an individual's life. This could also include things related to a parent with mental health or substance use disorders, right? And then that fourth category is historical. And these are those collective traumas that are experienced by groups of people across generations. So when I think about historical traumas, I think about things like the Holocaust, slavery, the genocide of Native Americans, Japanese internment camps, right? So these types of things that have kind of these historical implications to them. In addition to these main types of trauma, like I mentioned, there are lots of others. Some of the ones that we tend to highlight in some of our other trainings involve racial trauma, systemic trauma, right? So there's intergenerational trauma. So there are lots of different types, but these are four of the main types. So kind of thinking about this idea of trauma, a lot of this work around trauma really started after what we call the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. So this infographic gives us a very high level overview of what that study was. But basically, this is a study that was done in the 1990s. And researchers were starting to notice, based on the work they were doing in a weight loss clinic, that a lot of the patients who were coming in were reporting a history of childhood sexual abuse, right? So they started to make some connections between kind of health and mental health outcomes in adulthood and those things that we experience when we're children. So they designed a study that was looking at 10 things that individuals may have experienced in childhood. And those are the things you see in the blue bubbles there. So there were 3 types of abuse: emotional, physical, and sexual; 2 types of neglect, emotional and physical; and then 5 things they called household challenges. And those included domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation or divorce, and having an incarcerated parent. So what they did was they surveyed these adults about how many of these things they had experienced as children. So for each thing they answered yes to, they would get 1 point on what they called their ACE score for adverse childhood experiences, right? And then what they did was they looked at these ACE scores and they compared those to health, mental health, and social outcomes that these folks had also reported. So there were 2 main findings from this study. So the first was that ACEs were very common among the folks who answered that survey, right? So 67%, 2 out of every 3 individuals, reported experiencing at least one of those things in childhood. And 1 out of every 8 reported experiencing 4 or more of those ACEs. And if we look up at the top right side of the screen here, what you can see is some of the increased risk that was associated with having 4 or more ACEs. So things like 3 times the level of lung disease in adult smoking, 2 times the level of liver disease, 11 times the level of IV drug abuse, 14 times the number of suicide attempts, 4.5 times more likely to develop depression, right? And this is just a kind of sampling of some of those increased risks. The other thing that they noticed in this study was that for folks who had 6 or more of these ACEs, that the life expectancy could be shortened by up to 20 years, right? So these are things that are very important, but were not really being looked at before this study. Since this study, I always like to caution this here. There has been lots more research into this. So one of the things that we always like to caution as we're talking about this study, right? This was done in the 1990s. Lots has been done since then. Is that we don't ever want to think of an ACE score as destiny, right? So just because you may have an ACE score of 4 or 6 does not mean all of these bad things are going to happen to you or those individuals that you may be working with, right? So we know that there are other experiences people can have, things we call protective factors, positive childhood experiences that can also help to reduce a lot of this increased risk, right? And we know that people who are seeking treatment for these things can also really reduce that risk. So I don't want you to think that if you or someone you know has a high ACE score, that all these bad things are going to happen. But this was a very important study because it started to link these things that were happening to individuals in childhood and these mental health, and social outcomes in adulthood. So again, that initial study was done in the 1990s. Since then, our thinking around adversity has shifted. So the image you see on the screen here is what we call the 4 realms of ACEs, right? So those original ACEs, those things happening mostly in an individual's household, are represented in this image as the tree, right? So the abuse, the neglect, those things they called household dysfunction. But in addition to that, as time has gone on, other researchers have started looking at, well, what about the community experience that individuals have, right? How is that also tied to this? So to that tree down at the bottom in the roots there, we see what are called the adverse community environments. That may be things like poverty or violence, discrimination, poor housing quality, lack of social capital, lack of economic mobility, right? So thinking about the ways that all of those community level factors then are also influencing the tree. A third realm that was added up at the top there in the clouds is what we call the adverse climate experiences. And this includes things like hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, climate change, and more recently, COVID-19 was added to that list, right? So thinking about those things that may be related to the climate or the environment that aren't necessarily man-made, but still have a profound impact on individuals. And then the fourth and most recent realm to be added to this image is down in the soil and groundwater that the tree is planted in. And that's what we call the atrocious cultural experiences. And this kind of brings in that historical aspect that we were talking about before, right? But also remembering that these aren't just things that have happened historically. These are things that are continuing today, right? So some of the things that may be on this list, right? Forced family separation, segregation, colonization, genocide, right? So again, as we're thinking about adversity and how that impacts an individual, we want to make sure that we're thinking about that person within the context of the greater environment they live within. All right. So we're going to move on now to thinking a little bit more about the ways that trauma and adversity impact us. So we're going to be talking a little bit here about brain development and how trauma can have an impact on our brains and bodies. So as we think about brain development, the image you see on the right here is kind of a crude model for how the brain develops. So the first part of the brain that develops is what we call the brainstem, and that is in the yellowish orange color there in the center. This is the oldest part of our brain, and this is the part that's really responsible for keeping us alive, right? So a lot of those things we do without thinking, the regulation of our heartbeat and our breathing, our sleep, our appetite, all of that is housed in the brainstem. This is also the part of our brain that is responsible for that fight or flight mechanism, right? So when our body senses that we're in danger, this is the part that really takes over. The second part to develop in the green there is what we call our limbic brain. And this part of the brain is really responsible for attachment and the development of emotions, right? And then the third area that develops in the blue is what we call our cortical brain. And this is really the part of our brain that makes us human, right? Because we're one of the only animals that really develops this part of the brain. So this is what's responsible for kind of those higher order processing skills, thinking and learning, language, the regulation of our emotions, cause and effect thinking, right? So as we're thinking about this brain development, right? So much of a child's brain is developing before the age of 5. And that's why often you'll hear different programs in the community that focus on kind of that birth to 5 age range. That's because that's the most critical time for brain development. And what else is important for us to keep in mind is that our brains are uniquely designed to survive the world that we are in, right? So what happens is that when very young children are exposed to lots of highly stressful or traumatic events as their brain is developing, what happens, right, is that when that brain senses danger, it goes into those lower parts of the brain, right? That brain stem and that limbic brain. Those are the areas that really are responsible for kind of keeping them safe, right? That attachment, looking for those attachment figures. So what happens is that when that young person is spending so much of their time in that lower part or downstairs part of their brain, as some people call it, sometimes we see a lack of development then in those blue areas, in that cortical brain, right? So some of the areas that are responsible for language and that cause and effect thinking, memory. So again, this does not mean that there is something wrong with or deficient with that person's brain, right? Our brains are uniquely designed to survive the world that we're in. But sometimes we will see those types of impacts on brain development when a very young child is exposed to these types of stressful or traumatic incidences very early in life, right? So sometimes we'll see that show up in learning problems then later in school. Maybe we'll see that show up as delayed language, right? And again, this doesn't mean there's something wrong, but when we are aware that there may be some of these this lack of development in those cortical areas, then we can try to implement strategies that can help to build up those areas of the brain. All right. So again, as I kind of mentioned earlier when we were talking about the deep breathing techniques, so that brain stem, that very primitive part of our brain, that is responsible for our stress response, that fight or flight response. It's normal. That is our brain's natural reaction to danger, right? And as I mentioned earlier, it's not an event itself, right? But the way the person experiences that event and the effects it has. So as we're thinking about these potentially traumatic experiences, those are going to look very different for each person. And sometimes what I may think should not be traumatic for someone else may be, right? And that may be because their brain has been wired to expect danger, right? So again, these potentially traumatic experiences are going to be very different for everyone. And the way that we respond in these stressful or traumatic situations is going to look very different as well. So these are some of the common stress responses that we see. So you may be familiar with fight, flight, or freeze. This tells us a little bit more about what those look like. One of the things to keep in mind as we think about, a young person who may have that primary fight response is that they often tend to get these labels: demanding, controlling, oppositional, defiant, non-compliant, right? So it's very important for us when we are working with others and we start to hear some of these labels to kind of dig beneath those labels, right? And figure out what is going on with this person that's got them living in this stress response, right? They may feel unsafe in that situation. And if we can figure out what is causing them to feel unsafe, right, then we can help to kind of rectify that. Another thing that's very important to think about, especially as we're thinking about children, is that these flight and freeze responses can also mimic or look very similar to ADHD, right? So some of those normal stress responses in flight might be fidgeting, restlessness, hyperactivity, procrastinating, preoccupied. In freeze, we see difficulty completing tasks, zoned out, daydreaming, right? So as we talk with folks who are in roles as therapists or maybe psychiatrists who may be diagnosing or prescribing medication, we really like to hone in on the importance of gathering that background information to really know what's happened to or what's going on with this person versus just looking at symptoms. One other thing I'll point out on this screen before we move on is that more recently there has been another trauma response that is gaining more attention called the fawn response. And that is kind of that people-pleasing response, right? You know, if I do everything perfect, if I don't make any waves, if I don't make anyone upset, then no one will hurt me, right? And this fawn response often looks like the people pleaser, person who has trouble saying no, lack of boundaries, oftentimes lacks an identity because so much of their identity is caught up in just pleasing others, right? So as we think about what these responses might look like, you know, I think we're pretty familiar with fight, flight, and freeze and what those might look like. But this fawn response can be that person who you know, is just from the outside looks like they've got everything together, everything in their life looks great, they're excelling at work, but that kind of people pleasing, right? That lack of boundaries and saying no, that is also a trauma response. All right, so kind of that is the wrap up then of the overview of trauma and adversity. So the main thing that we're going to be focusing on today, again, is the 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach from SAMHSA. And again, those are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of these. So principle 1 is safety. And this is kind of the one that everything else is built on, right? If we don't feel safe, or if the individuals we're working with don't feel safe, it's going to be hard to really do any of those other things that we'll talk about later. So we definitely want to make sure this is a very high priority. We want to think about both physical and emotional safety, right? So some of the strategies under this safety category here are creating predictable environments, right? So when we know what to expect, that feels safe, right? So the more we can have schedules, routines, structures in place, right? Very clear rules and expectations that are, you know, kind of gone over frequently, right? Just saying them one time, everyone may not remember those, right? So having rules and expectations posted, schedules posted, letting folks know if there's going to be a change to the schedule or routine can be very helpful. Right, and as we think about that emotional safety, some things to consider, you know, our nonverbal cues, our body language, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a bit. Our tone, right? Do we have that connected, caring relationship? Another big one is, you know, is there representation in the room or the environment, right? So if folks are coming to your organization to seek services, if they look around the office, are they going to see images that that kind of capture their identities, right? Are they going to see employees who may look like them, right? That really helps to create that sense of emotional safety. So we're going to watch a quick video here that will talk a little bit more about what creating a predictable environment may look like in a school setting, right? So this is about a 5-minute video. I'm probably going to cut it a little bit short because the end is just talking a little bit more about statistics. But we will get started here.
Good morning, Dean Ellis.
Good morning, Karen.
Good morning, Angel.
Good morning, Dan Ellis.
I think before any learning can take place, the students really need to feel safe, feel like they're seen, and feel like they're cared about. The impact I see from morning meeting is that classes are true communities. We're learning from each other's strengths, we're helping each other. It's a foundation for everything that comes after.
Good morning, Miss Gallagher.
Morning meetings are a really important part of the responsive classroom model, which we use here throughout Highlander Charter School. It's a chance for the students to make that transition from home to school. It's a way for everyone to settle in and feel that they're a part of a community.
It puts me in a focused and good mood. It makes me feel ready to learn.
So welcome. I'm so excited to see you guys today. Our morning meeting lasts about 15 minutes and we have 4 parts that we do together. Each classroom might be a little different the way the teacher runs it. We start with our greeting. The kids choose what the greeting is for that day. That helps them want to participate.
Good morning, Alvin. Good morning, Alvin.
We make eye contact. We're having our ears, our eyes, and our brain on the person who's speaking.
Good morning, Benjamin.
How are you feeling today? Are you ready to learn? If you're not ready to learn, what can we do there?
After the greeting, we do share. I like it when people share because we got to know them a little better. There's like a little board, and whoever went, you had to check them off, and you had to say what you did on the weekend. I went to the movie. What was in the movie? When the movie died.
We've had a lot of interesting issues come up through shares, whether it be deaths in the family, politics and people feeling safe or not safe because of that. You know, things you might not normally talk about in a first grade classroom. Morning meeting gives you the space and the time to have those conversations.
Today my grandparents are coming. I'm ready for questions for Tom.
They get to answer questions. Somebody cares about me. All these hands are interested in me.
Didn't they come last time? Yeah, but they had to go back because something happened in the country. Morning meeting makes me feel calm and happy. My favorite part is the glitter jar.
We shake the glitter jar, we put it in the middle. The kids have a moment to watch.
Mr. B puts the timer on for a minute. We reflect on what we can do to get yourself ready for the day. Today we got to think about how you can be helpful to your friends.
So is there someone who would like to share a Kusana?
If somebody's sad, you can help them feel better by playing with them.
Okay, I like that. Nice job.
After the share, we get to do a game. 1, 2. Someone counts without looking. People go into corners. 9, 10. Corner number 3. Oh. 1.
It really gives them a chance to get that last burst of energy out before it's time for them to sit down to the serious business of literacy.
Corner number 1.
Then after that, I go over the agenda every day. Knowing what's going to happen next is really important to kids. After that is
PE.
then we get to eat our
Lunch.
then we're gonna have some
Math hour.
so that kind of sets the tone. We're here together, morning meeting, we know what's going on with everyone, we're ready to go.
So I know 15 minutes can sometimes be a hard thing to try to put in your schedule, but students in each classroom know that they're coming into safe places. This is a chance for them to have voice in their classroom.
It's about respecting each other, respecting your teacher. It's rooted in positive interactions. It definitely helps set our culture.
I think it wouldn't be as easy to do the rest of the day. It helps me a lot.
All right. So again, you know, this is thinking about what this may look like in a school setting, but a lot of the things that we heard in this video can also be applied to other settings, right? Those check-ins with folks when they first show up, right? Instead of just jumping into what we may have on our agenda, really giving that time to check in, to see how that person is in that moment. Maybe something has happened earlier and maybe they need to kind of process that before we can really get into that work. So just some ideas for creating predictable environments. Another thing that can be really helpful in creating safety is making sure that when folks are feeling, you know, maybe escalated or highly emotional, that we respond in a way that is going to be appropriate. So when we do have someone who is kind of responding from that downstairs brain, as we talked about earlier, right, the brain stem, the limbic brain, it's really helpful to remember these 3 R's. Sometimes it can be it can feel very natural to jump straight into reasoning, right? If you don't stop X, Y, or Z, then there's going to be A, B, or C consequence, right? But if we think back to those parts of the brain, that part that is responsible for cause and effect thinking is in the upstairs brain, right? And that part of the brain may be very hard for that person to access in that moment. So before we get to reasoning, we always want to start with regulation and relating to that person. So regulation, again, is going to look like maybe giving that person some time and space to cool off before we start talking to them. Maybe engaging in some of those types of deep breathing exercises, right? Some guided exercise where we incorporate some larger muscle movement in there can also be super helpful with regulation. And we're going to talk on the next slide about something we call co-regulation, which can be super helpful for young children in particular, because we don't just know how to regulate on our own. That's something we learn in relationship with other. So sometimes it can be very helpful for us to practice these skills with that young person as they are having these big emotions. Again, I know this graphic says child, but these strategies can also be helpful with adults. So after we have that person back in kind of a regulated state, then we want to relate to them. We want to let them know we understand. It's normal to have big feelings. Being angry is okay. Sometimes the things we do when we're angry aren't okay, right? But all of our feelings are normal and okay. Let them know we're there to support them. We want to work with them to kind of get through this. And then once we've done that relation, we feel connected again to that person, then we can get into that reasoning. This may be where we talk about what happened, what may have caused them to feel upset, some things they could do differently in the future, if there's any kind of consequence that may need to happen. This would be the time to really talk about that. So this is another graphic called 12 Ways to Co-Regulate with Your Child, right? So as we are thinking about some things that we can do, right? Again, some of the exercise, taking walks, moving our bodies together, those breathing exercises, right? Modeling deep breathing. Let's take some deep breaths together, right? We want to lower our body position so that it doesn't seem like we're this big, scary figure, right? We want to kind of be on their level, lower our voice. Sometimes it's helpful for us to stop talking and just listen, kind of give that time for folks to kind of get back down to a baseline. Again, the importance of nonverbal communication, right? So a study that was done by Albert Mehrabian, I may have mispronounced that, looked at when folks are trying to see what they believe based on what they hear, right? How much of that is due to the words that we're saying versus the nonverbal communication. And what this study showed was that only 7% of the message that's received by another person is the actual words that we were using. 38% had to do with the pitch, tone, or inflection of our voice. And 55% was due to the body language that person was using, their facial expression, their eye contact, those types of things. So again, as we're thinking about working with folks who may be dysregulated or escalated, a lot of what we need to do is kind of checking our own body language to ensure that we are kind of presenting as very kind of open, calm, relaxed, not intimidating. Some different verbal de-escalation strategies, right? So again, some of this has to do with the way that we're showing up, our physical presence, our facial expressions, with listening, right? We kind of talked about the listening. What we call active listening can be very helpful, where maybe we're just kind of using nonverbal prompts, right? Kind of nodding our head as that person is talking to show that we're following, right? One big thing that we always like to talk about is sometimes folks can think that touch could be very comforting, but if that person has experienced some type of negative event related to touch, that can be very triggering. So definitely if we're working with someone who is having big emotions, only touch if permission is granted. Some of the verbal de-escalation strategies, right? So sometimes diversion or distraction can be helpful. Redirecting their attention to something else, using humor. Again, validating their feelings. Feeling angry at that situation is pretty normal, right? And again, providing choices, which we'll get to here in just a bit. Some things to avoid. Saying calm down, a lot of times that is not super helpful. Taking the behavior personally, right? There's kind of a saying in the trauma literature, they're not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time, right? So although a lot of times those behaviors we may be reacting to may feel very personal, it's important to remember that this is about that person kind of struggling in that moment. So trying to not take those things personally. And I'm trying to make sure we've got enough time here. So we're going to take just a very quick break here to do a stand and stretch. So this is what we call the ABC's movement game that we've created at SCAN to help build these movement breaks into an individual's day. So we are going to, if you feel comfortable, we're going to spell out the word heal, H-E-A-L. So we're going to do 5 big arm circles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in our seats for E, we're going to do a seated forward fold. So I'm just going to fold myself over. We're going to hold that for 3, 2, 1. All right, and then for A, we're going to do 3 big deep breaths, right? So we want to go in through our nose, hold for just a second, and then out through our mouths, right? So here we go. 1, 2, 3. All right, and then L, we're going to push our feet against the floor for 10 seconds. So in your seat, you just want to kind of push down as hard as you can with your feet on the floor. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So again, this is something that can be super helpful especially if you're working with young folks, but also as adults. It's really helpful to build these movement breaks into our day to help our bodies kind of get rid of some of that stress and tension that we hold on to throughout the day. All right, I know we're rushing here, but hopefully this is all making sense, and we will have a little bit of time for questions. So principle 2 is trustworthiness and transparency, right? So we want to make sure that decisions are made transparently. The goal is really to build and maintain the other individual's trust. So we can do that through things like openly explaining policies and procedures, being true to our word and following through, right? And sometimes things come up and we may not be able to make an appointment that we had scheduled, right? But again, making sure that we are communicating that to that person and kind of letting them know. Sometimes we make mistakes as well, right? What's important is that we then follow that up with an apology, right? And we repair that trust and continue to kind of build on that relationship. So as we think about transparency, especially when working with young folks, some of the things that can be helpful are visual cues, right? So if we have certain things that we need someone to do, making sure that we've got kind of these checklists, these visual cues that have photos that make it very easy to remember what all of those things are that we need to do. All right, so our third principle here is peer support. And when we talk about peer support in the context of trauma-informed strategies, peer often refers to trauma survivors, right? Basically, folks who have been through similar things as the person that they are working with, right? And this peer support really has a way of establishing safety, of hope, right? If you are going through a tough situation and you're working with someone else who has had a similar situation and come out on the other side, right? That can really help to build up that hope, can really enhance that collaboration. So some of the strategies that we think about when utilizing peer support may be using client stories or lived experiences, right, to promote healing and resiliency. Allowing peers to become the experts, right? So a lot of times we think about the experts as folks who have studied or gone to school for certain things, right? but it's also important to think about experts as folks who have this lived experience. So we have another very short video. This one's only about 2 minutes that will talk about a family peer support program so you can get a better idea of what this may look like kind of in real life.
My children have different mental health challenges. My oldest son is more property destructive, but my daughter was the one that actually was physically aggressive with me, hitting, punching, kicking, throwing me to the ground. The youngest son also would punch. They actually too would gang up on me, and I've had to call the police. I had to do something, and they witnessed a lot of domestic violence. So a lot of that came from the trauma of that. And I didn't realize that at the time, that they can absorb so much. It can be so isolating. My son was hospitalized twice. My daughter was hospitalized 3 times. I felt like a failure. I felt like I couldn't do anything right. And no one could understand what I was going through. I felt like no one was listening to me. I had no voice. And it wasn't until the family support partner came in that she really understood. She navigated the system. She had her own experience. And I was like, finally, somebody has been in my shoes. She gave encouragement, and I didn't feel so alone. Having someone that understands is different than somebody is just saying they understand, because she has felt that own inner struggle too. And she also pointed out my strengths. It was kind of like eye-opening. She gave that empowerment to me. I don't think I would be in a better place without a peer support partner, because then I would still feel alone. I would still feel that I'm the only parent out there going through what I'm going through. And she was there every step of the way. It's been a good experience.
All right. So moving on to our 4th principle here, which is collaboration and mutuality. So as we think about collaboration and mutuality, oftentimes when we have folks who are seeking services and folks who are providing services, there tend to be these uneven power relationships, right? So those folks who are working for the agency seem to have more decision-making power, right, than the folks who are actually coming in to receive services. So this collaboration and mutuality is really about the leveling of those power differentials, right? So we know that healing happens within relationships, and that in order for folks to feel empowered, that we really need to share that power with them. So some strategies to think about as we are considering collaboration and mutuality are involving the individual in their goal planning, seeking their input and feedback, working to enhance their motivation and engagement, providing opportunities for folks to contribute as well as to receive. And last and very importantly here, right, that shared decision making, right? So we shouldn't be guiding the treatment of individuals without their input into that. So again, just thinking through an example of what this could look like, student-led, IEP meetings are one example here. And this is where we would have the student kind of leading their individual education plan meeting. So by doing this, right, we are helping to improve and build on a variety of different skills, right? Their ability to advocate for themselves, their self-determination, right? They are having more of a voice in choosing these things. Their leadership ability, right? If they are leading a meeting, their communication skills. So this is just one example, and I do have a link here that will take you, if you want to find more information about those, that can be super helpful. Again, as we're thinking about these, building these relationships, this collaboration, this mutuality, here are some additional resources that you can use. So on the left, we have some different questions that can help to build relationships, lots and lots of them. And over on the right, some questions that could replace how was your day, right? To get more from our kids. What did you do that was creative? Who did you play with? What are you looking forward to tomorrow? What was the best part of the day, right? So the more that we can really get to know and understand others, the more connected we feel to them. All right, so principle 5 is empowerment, voice, and choice. So this is, again, building off of the previous principles here, but the strengths and experiences of individuals are recognized and built upon. The client becomes a part of the decision-making and the goal setting, right? So again, just like we were talking about in the last one there with the collaboration, right? This helps folks to feel empowered. And staff really become facilitators of and not controllers of recovery. So some of the strategies to consider for this principle are providing acceptable choices, planning or setting goals with the individual, giving some autonomy within decision making, representing the individual's voice in decision making, and creating a space that really celebrates successes. And again, folks are able and feel safe to bring their failures, right? And we can help them problem solve through that. So thinking about, again, offering controlled choices. So sometimes it can be overwhelming when the amount of choice that we're given doesn't have bounds. And especially when we're working with children, it can be very helpful to offer what we call controlled choices, right? So there are certain things, different types of questions we can ask, this or that, right? Do you want to walk back to the car or do you want to race back to the car? How to do it again, right? How many? Would you like 2 or 3 fish sticks? Who will help? Do you want mom to tuck you in for bed or do you want dad to tuck you in for bed? What color do you want to wear, your blue shirt or your red shirt today? Right? So as we're giving these choices, we're limiting the number and we're only giving choices that we are okay with, right? So I don't want to maybe say, oh, where do you want to go on vacation? And then, the child says, well, I want to go to Australia. It's like, well, we can't afford that, right? So we want to make sure that we are giving those controlled choices where we're okay with either of the answers. Another thing that we can do here that kind of helps with that empowerment, that voice and choice, instead of saying something like make a good choice, here are some other things we could say. What do you hope will happen here? Will anybody get hurt or upset by that choice? Do you want any help with this situation? What options do you have here? Right? And all of this is kind of building those critical thinking skills in kids as well, those problem solving skills, helping them think through their choices, but also be able to make those informed choices. All right, and our last principle here is cultural, historical, and gender issues. So in this trauma-informed approach, we want to make sure that we are recognizing, acknowledging, and working to combat both historical and current cultural and race-based traumas, systems of oppression, and gender issues. So as we're thinking through these strategies, again, we want to actively work to dismantle systems of oppression and racism, right? That may look like policy advocacy, right? That may look like work that we're doing in our day-to-day lives in the organizations that we're a part of. Utilizing the healing value of traditional cultural connections, which can be super, super important as we're thinking about immigrant and refugee populations, right? Coming to a new country, maybe not having some of those familial connections, those cultural connections. So the more we can do to really surround those individuals with some of those cultural connections, that can be super helpful and super healing. Again, as we talked about before with safety, representation of the people served within the space or environment, materials and literature that are accessible to all people served. So not just whether I see images or people who look like me, but are there forms available in my native language, right? So again, just thinking about all of these things as we're going through. For folks who may be in clinical roles, one tool that is available to kind of help with this is in the DSM-5, the cultural formulation interview. So this is a tool that really just helps the clinician in the situation to understand how the problems that individual is presenting with may be viewed or interpreted in their culture, right? So oftentimes we kind of come at things from different angles, and this can just be a helpful tool for a clinician and client to really make sure they're on the same page with that information about the presenting problems that individual is seeking services for. All right. Lastly here, this is a graphic, again, just thinking about re-traumatization and some of the systems level and relationship level factors that may contribute to that. So things like having to continually retell our stories, being seen as a label, not having choice in our services or treatment. On the relationship side, not being seen or heard, racial profiling, victim blaming, right? So if you are thinking about ways to kind of avoid that re-traumatization, this is a great graphic. This is a resource folder that we have created with lots of different trauma-informed resources. I will be dropping the link in the chat, so I'm going to skip over this for now so that we will have time. But if there are any questions or comments, we do have about 4 more minutes. I'm happy to answer those. And then also this is my contact info in case anyone would like to reach out about anything else.
Joseph, thank you so much for sharing so many practical strategies. There are a lot of, I'm excited to get your presentation and look back
Awesome.
over those. Yeah, thank you for making it so practical.
Absolutely. All right, and I did just drop a few links in the chat. The first is for our training email list. So we have lots of different trainings, free trainings that are open to the community. Most of them are virtual. So if you want to sign up for a training email list, that is there. Our training website to sign up for any of our trainings, and then also the link there to that trauma-informed resource folder.
Well, if you guys don't have any question, I think we're almost 2 minutes away to as well. Joseph, thank you so much for staying between the time as well. I hope you guys have the best rest of the afternoon. Hope to see you in the next session as well. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all so much.